Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight for our next virtual event with David Hill and Clark here to discuss David's new book, The Vapors, A Southern Family, the New York Mob, and the Rise and Fall of Hot Springs, America's Forgotten Capital of Vice. We are so excited and grateful that our bookstore can continue to bring authors and their works to our community during this uncertain time and expand our community virtually outside of Los Angeles. So we're extra appreciative for you joining us tonight. And we'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, which you can learn about on our website by signing up for our newsletter and as well as our social media at BookSoup. Our next event is scheduled for this coming Monday at 6 p.m. with Anna David and Lisa Smith to discuss Anna's book, Make Your Mess Your Memoir, which you can find on our Crowdcast page as well. This evening's event will end with a Q&A, and to submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, please click the like button, and we will try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Also, please consider supporting our bookstore in David by purchasing a copy of tonight's book, which you can do by clicking the green button, which is also right below the viewer screen, and it will take you out of the window, but it won't disrupt the presentation. So if you want to do that while it's happening, you are more than welcome to do that. And with that said, let me introduce our guest speakers for this evening. David Hill is a writer from Hot Springs, Arkansas. His work has appeared regularly in Grantland and The Ringer and has been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times, GQ, and New York Magazine, as well as on This American Life. He lives in Nyack, New York, with his wife and 3 children, where he serves as the vice president of the National Writers Union. The Vapors is his first book. Thanks for being with us tonight, David.
Thank you.
And our other guest this evening is Clark Duke, an actor, writer, and director best known for Clark and Michael, The Office, Kick-Ass, and Hot Tub Time Machine. Originally from Arkansas as well, Clark attended film school at Loyola Marymount University. His thesis film was the pilot for Clark and Michael. He was most recently seen alongside Vince Vaughn, Liam Hemsworth, and John Malkovich in his featured directorial debut, Arkansas. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to our guests tonight. Thank you both for being with us.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me. That was a really thorough intro, the Wikipedia-like intro of myself. But if anybody else was wondering, like, why am I moderating this with David today? I'm also from Hot Springs, Arkansas, where David is from and where the book is set. And I also released in the middle of COVID a movie set in Hot Springs, Arkansas. My movie's called Arkansas. And it was, a story set over 30 years with like multiple point of views. And my grandfather was this kind of tertiary Dixie Mafia character that kind of overlapped with some of the same elements that are in The Vapors. So we have more than a few very specific things in common. And that's why I'm here today. So, I love the book. I'm kind of obviously like right in the middle of like 4 Venn diagrams of like the perfect audience for this book. For anybody watching that hasn't read it, it feels to me like it's sort of chronologically a sequel to Boardwalk Empire and like a prequel to Casino. And it's interesting because it's this time period in American history that not a lot of people seem to know about. Like it almost reads like historical fiction. Like it kind of reminded me of like James Ellroy's like Cold 6000 or something, which is one of my favorite books, where it's like this kind of just right under the surface of like the history, Yeah. But it's all real. It's all researched, and you're a journalist, and you actually moved back to Hot Springs and like heavily researched and interviewed people. So it's just so wild when you read the book because it reads like this great narrative fiction, but it's all true. So I thought, let's start with talking about what kind of got you into this story in the world in the first place, which is also, kind of funnily enough, like the thing that got me into my movie, which is one of your grandparents is a character in the book, and it was involved in the world. Could you talk about her a little? Like, were you guys close growing up, or was it more of you researching her life later and how you filtered out kind of the reality from the fiction of it all?
Yeah, I think both. I mean, I was definitely close to Hazel growing up. When I was a kid, she'd look after us sometimes. I mean, in the 80s, Hazel had, she'd kind of come a long way from the Hazel you meet in the book, and had kicked a lot of her addiction issues, but she was still a bit, she wasn't that far out of her like wild years. And, she spent the like 70s traveling with the carnival, with carnies and stuff. And so when I was a kid, she lived in a little trailer in Hot Springs, and she drove this like real beat up old Plymouth. And she'd keep me and my sister a lot at her trailer. And her trailer was kind of like filled with these little, I don't know, these little mementos and, kind of memories of the old days, like matchbooks and chips and things like that, ashtrays from these clubs. And so I felt like, I grew up, like we all did, around these sort of artifacts of this time that wasn't even that long ago, but had been sort of successfully erased, like swept under the rug. So I knew Hazel. I definitely didn't know that much about her life. I learned more about her life as I got older from my father after she had passed. But I really learned most of the sort of harrowing stuff when I started writing this book.
An interesting thing you just said is there's still like the kind of ghosts of all this stuff very much still present in the city of Hot Springs. Like every time I go home, like my girlfriend always wants to go to downtown Hot Springs and look around, because it basically is like a standing movie set. It's like one of those old ghost pioneer towns they used to shoot Westerns in. And it's just like, the Vapors is still there. The Aristocrat is still there. The Arlington, like all the locations from the book are basically still there. And they just never reopened as anything else. But it's interesting because it seems like just now, even the city kind of realized in the pretty recent past that like, oh, we should capitalize on this and like the history heritage of it. It's just weird. It's just weird to me that like it's not even on a local level. They haven't tried to make a bigger thing of like this bizarre history they have.
It's true. Like the embracing of the kind of criminal history of Hot Springs is really kind of a recent phenomenon. And, I think that's because, Hot Springs and really the whole state of Arkansas, right at the end of gambling, tried really hard to distance themselves from the reputation of it being kind of a sin city. I mean, the end of gambling was really there were a lot of things that contributed to it, as you'll see in the book, but like one of the contributing factors was like the sort of the Baptists around the state kind of getting fed up to the point where they were like not going to tolerate it anymore. So there was a bit of a, kind of a pious, like like a zealotry behind shutting it down too. And that meant that Hot Springs in the 70s and 80s tried to reinvent itself as like a family resort, right? And so when I was a kid, Hot Springs was more known for like the Passion Play or the Witness or whatever, if you remember that. They were like or like the Southern clubs of Wax Museum, right? So, or they tried to have a theme park or the IQ Zoo. Like they really wanted to lean into being more of a family resort. They didn't want to give up on tourism, but they wanted to give up on liquor and gambling. But having said all that, I also grew up in Hot Springs when there were 7 strip clubs, for a town of 25,000 people. So as much as they, tried to like sweep the gambling under the rug, a lot of the kind of like, people, tourists are still tourists, and like, people were still coming to the town for the track, and so
that's the other thing. That's the other thing is Oaklawn is still there. Like even though they ran all this stuff up, they still have one of the premier like horse racing tracks in the country, which now is opening, which has like a fully functioning like Vegas style casino now. Right. And they're building this huge new tower building. But yeah, it's interesting because I always had such a confusing relationship with the place too, because I'd be like, because now when you go downtown, they've got like this the statue on the bench of like Al Capone sitting there in the Gangster Museum and all this stuff, and it's like, well, why are you trying to like? It's like now they're trying to like capitalize on this thing that they spent forever running off.
That's right,
and they basically chased off the economic engine of the entire region.
Right, and it obviously required some distance, for people to be willing to like embrace it again. But even today, I mean, that embracing it is in maybe in kind of a corny way, right? I mean, when I was a teenager, I worked at the Arlington Hotel, and I was I had a lot of jobs when I worked there, but one of them was I was like a host in the dining room, and like there was this one table where like nobody wanted to sit because it was kind of close to the kitchen where the kitchen workers would come in and out. No one wanted to sit there. So my boss told me that whenever I had to sit somebody there, I had to tell them it was out the table Al Capone liked to sit at because he had his back to the wall or whatever. He could see the door. And I would tell people this. And I remember one time I sat this old guy and his wife there, and I told him that, and he was so excited. He like ran up to his room and he came back down with a fedora and a cigar. He made me take his picture, and I felt so guilty, indulging him. But like, it's like there's this like, it required, I think, the whole culture kind of deciding that they were going to embrace this very corny version of like organized crime as being like,
almost
I don't know, like these,
like folksy.
Yeah, it's almost kitsch. Yeah, these characters became, they didn't become real anymore. They became almost like cartoon characters in passing, even though they were, Al Capone was like a psychopath,
Well, from Capone, let's transition to the kind of gangsters that were really more focused and actually lived there, which were some of the main characters in the book. Also, Oni Madden and Dane Harris. Do you want to talk about? Oni's story is really interesting, just how he got there, because Oni Madden is a guy. He was one of the characters in Boardwalk Empire, and a guy that was like a contemporary of Capone and Meyer Lansky and all those guys. But I don't think a lot of people know that he spent the back nine of his life in this little resort town. Yeah,
in Arkansas. It's weird, right? I mean, he's not even just a New Yorker. He was British. Like, so he immigrates to New York from Leeds, and he becomes, as a really young man, he becomes a leader on the west side of Manhattan among the Irish gangs. He becomes a leader of the Gophers. So like, Oni Madden is kind of a figure in gangs of New York. And then when he gets older, he becomes, after he gets out of prison and Prohibition is on, he becomes a Prohibition leader in New York. I mean, he becomes one of the like top 3 kind of crime lords in New York City, Prohibition bosses. And he runs the Cotton Club, and he manages a lot of important people, movie stars and athletes, like contracts and stuff. He's a super powerful guy. And so he goes to prison for murder. And when he gets out, because back in those days, you could get out of prison for murder. You could go to prison for murder and actually get out. Although, there were a lot of strings that got pulled in New York to get him out, and that was one of the sort of legends about Oni, was that they pulled so many strings to get him out that he had to hit the road. He had to leave town. So they told him by the time he gets out of prison, Prohibition's done, right? Like there's no more Prohibition. So the mob has turned to gambling and prostitution as like their major rackets. And the mob, Meyer Lansky has really kind of organized the mob around, kind of a national syndicate. So they send Oni to Arkansas, because Arkansas was this major gambling capital, and that was where a lot of their economic interest lied. So they told him he should probably lay low in Arkansas. He becomes like the mob's man in Arkansas. He marries a local, and he ends up kind of playing house and ends up staying there to the end of his life. And so he's one of the 3 major figures in the book. And Oni Madden had a lot to do with the fortunes, the fate and fortune of Hot Springs. And so not only do not a lot of people know that he ended up in Arkansas, but I don't even think a lot of people in Arkansas know how important he was to, what happened in that city either.
Yeah, totally. Talk about Dane a little bit and how his relationship with Oni and how he got, because he's another interesting character.
Well, Dane's the third sort of major character in the book is Dane Harris, and he was Dane was a local guy. He was this child of a Cherokee bootlegger. And he grows up poor. He grows up, in the Hot Springs area, and goes to Fountain Lake. And he comes back from University of Arkansas Law School, sort of drops out of school to come help his father run a liquor store. And not just any liquor store, but like a liquor store that was illegally selling liquor to restaurants. Because back then, even though Prohibition was over, Arkansas did not permit people to sell liquor by the glass.
People can't believe when I tell them that I'm from I was born in Hot Springs, and
looks like we might have lost Clark, or you lost me. Not sure.
Can you hear me?
Frozen. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. What's the last thing you heard me say there?
That you were born in Hot Springs, but.
But I went to high school in a county over, and it was a dry county, and nobody can ever believe that dry county still exists in America.
Still?
Like that. Yeah. They can't understand. They're like, wait, so you can't. There's not even there's no liquor in restaurants. Like it's wild.
Right. Yeah. So even during that time, no one could sell liquor by the glass. And Dane's father ran a liquor store where they sold liquor to restaurants, and he helps his dad run the place. But he sort of rises the economic and political ranks in Hot Springs and becomes what's known as sort of the boss gambler. I guess this is the term they used. And the boss gambler is like the casino proprietor that kind of is the boss of all the other casino proprietors. And there had been a string of these in Hot Springs over the years. Some, very successful, some weren't. But Dane becomes a really important one. And Oni was sort of a mentor to Dane. He took him under his wing at a very young age and recognized some promise, not only in Dane, but in also his friends, his generation, I guess you could say. And Dane and his friends and his generation had to beat a political machine, in order to take power, right? They were never going to be able to get in on the casino business any other way. They had to win an election, but elections were completely rigged. So a big part of the drama about Dane's rise to power is how, what all they had to do to win those elections. I mean, they literally had to like arm up and treat it like it was like a military exercise. And they're ultimately successful, and Dane becomes boss gambler. And he's a visionary. He sees what Hot Springs is as being like the first step towards something really big. Like, he believes that Hot Springs should grow and expand, which really put him, made him different than other boss gamblers. Hot Springs had long had gambling, but it was never something that people really ever thought could be scaled up the way that Dane really thought it could. And so Dane kind of imagined Hot Springs being Las Vegas before Las Vegas was Las Vegas. And he worked really hard to try to make that happen, and ultimately was thwarted in that.
Yeah, I mean, some of the, like you said, like the biggest thing, and we'll talk about this in a second, is basically, why is the town not Las Vegas? Because it would just be so awesome if, instead of being out in the middle of this hideous desert, Las Vegas was in this beautiful resort in the middle of the country, surrounded by lakes, rivers, like healing water flowing out of the ground. And but I find in the book the political aspect of it is so interesting, because for people that haven't read the book, even though Hot Springs had these casinos and gambling was such a big part of life there in the early and mid 20th century, it was never legal. Right. And like, talk about that a little bit, just how that operated, that you had this one. I mean, it's pretty mind blowing that like they basically, like, I can't even think of a comparable thing that can, use as an analogy, because it's like,
there really isn't anything.
Yeah. Like, what other like fully criminal activity could you just set up major corporations running with like payrolls and employees, and they just allow it to happen?
Yeah. I mean, there really isn't anything other than maybe, there's not. I mean, during Prohibition, there were speakeasies everywhere, and there were a lot of like places you could go, and everyone knew you could get liquor, but it was never on the menu. Yeah. That isn't even comparable to this, because this was not backroom gambling. These were casinos
they're big
that were advertised as such.
Yeah.
Right. It was like come to the like Southern Club casino, and that's all there was to do there was to gamble, and there was no secret password. It was just open on open to the street. And there were the signs in the window saying "Come play roulette," and it was completely illegal. And so I don't think there's anything in American history comparable to the scale of this sort of criminal enterprise going on in front of God and everybody, and that all the way up to the governor, it was just permitted to happen. And that's there's this
Bible Belt too.
Yeah, in the middle of Arkansas, in the middle of the Bible Belt. So like I think that's part of what makes it even more remarkable, is that Hot Springs was pulling all this off while they were in the middle of a state where the rest of the state hated it. They hated it. They desperately wanted to get rid of it. And so that just sort of speaks to how much money they really gave people like Governor Faubus and governors, before him, to permit this to happen, because it was so unpopular throughout the rest of the state. But they still pulled it off. In order to pull it off, every single elected official in Hot Springs had to be in on it. Really, almost everybody in the whole county, because if you had one person, I mean, if the clerk, if the court clerk or like the dog catcher was not on program, they could really, shut the whole thing down. So every elected official had to be in on it, and the governor of the state had to be in on it. And as long as you had that, you had a license to just do whatever you wanted. And so, because the governor would just say, whenever he'd be called on to enforce the law, would say, that's a local issue. Yeah. If the local police or the local officials contact me and ask me to send in the state troopers, I will. But if they don't, I'm going to let them handle it themselves. Of course, that call is never going to come, right? So, but at one point in the 1960s, when Bobby Kennedy becomes Attorney General, he sends Department of Justice investigators down there to check this out because he's hearing about what's going on in Hot Springs, and they are flabbergasted. They spend one afternoon walking around to these clubs, and they had a press conference that day. They were like, we're going to do it right here at the, get the press here now because we're going to do it in our hotel lobby. And they said this is the largest illegal gambling operation in America, which is a big deal given that, like, this is a city of 25,000 people. And, at that point in time, I mean, like, there was plenty of illegal gambling going on in Chicago and New York, Miami, but nothing like what was going on in Hot Springs. And I think that while, people in DC might have heard rumors about what was going on, until they got there and saw it with their own two eyes, I think it just wasn't real to them. And once they saw 1,000 people in the vapors, betting $100 chips with both hands, they were like, what is this? How is this happening? So yeah, it's amazing that it happened. And it's also amazing that that this is a story that people haven't told, because we're talking a half a century of this. This wasn't like a blip. It wasn't like a couple of years of this, like a half a century of Hot Springs being Las Vegas, being America's first gambling resort. And we've completely buried so much of this history.
Yeah. And a lot of the principal characters, either are still alive or have not been dead that long. Like, it's not like we're about, 200 or 300 years ago.
Right.
It's interesting to me, like, just how, and I mean, this might take too long and be too much to get into, but just how it happened, like, how Hot Springs became this weird place in the middle of this Bible Belt thing, like that, turned into what should have been Las Vegas. Like, I think I'm basically just mad all the time that it's not Las Vegas, because it would just be so fun.
Yeah, and it for anybody that like is in lives in Hot Springs today. I mean, anybody today looking at these two cities would think it couldn't have been, right? Like, you could not imagine Hot Springs having 1 million people living there, billions of dollars of investment in the city, like international people coming from all over the world, like, you couldn't imagine that in a little tiny, hamlet like Hot Springs. But if you were in 1952 and you stood in those two cities, you wouldn't be able to imagine it in Las Vegas, right? I mean, they had no running water, they had no sewer, they had no, electricity. I mean, it was like they built Las Vegas out of literally nothing, where Hot Springs had kind of the infrastructure for this. They had been building the infrastructure for this for 50 years. So much back then, it was a better bet to do it in Hot Springs than Las Vegas. It's just that it was illegal in Nevada and they couldn't legalize it in Arkansas.
Well, that's even a scene in the book where Dane goes to Vegas and he just kind of looks around. It's like, who in the hell would want to be out here? Like, this is awful. Yeah,
Dane Harris is given the opportunity to buy in on, in the early days of the Frontier. He and some of his partners are offered an opportunity to buy in out there and help take over a Las Vegas casino. And he chooses not to. He decides that the future is Hot Springs, not Las Vegas, right? He made a terrible bet, but he bet on his hometown and he bet on Arkansas, and he really believed in Arkansas. He thought that would be where it was going to be at, and he was wrong. But he had that opportunity, and if he had done it, he'd have been phenomenally wealthy. And he, but who could blame him, right? I mean, if you were standing out there in the desert back then, you probably would have thought, God, it's awful out here.
Do you think? I mean, and this is kind of like, I get like more postscript to the book than anything in the book, but I mean, do you see it eventually becoming legal in Hot Springs, the gambling becoming like fully legalized in Hot Springs? I mean, now that Oaklawn is opening a full-blown casino, because there's been like incremental steps over the years. Like, I know for a while they just had like the video cards, instead of like physical cards being dealt if you play blackjack, and now it's real dealers. And
well, what they did in Arkansas is similar to what they've done in a lot of states. They passed this law to legalize casino gambling, but they only give the permits to certain places, right? And so Oaklawn's one of those places. I doubt there'll be gambling anywhere other than Oaklawn in Hot Springs, but there probably doesn't need to be. I mean, what's weird is, this is a day late and a dollar short. I mean, there's casino gambling in over 40 states now. So like, who needs another town where there's like 24 casinos, like people who already live in Hot Springs could drive to a casino in 3 hours or so. So like the days of like Las Vegas is lucky that they were the first, because now Las Vegas is kind of a thing. It's like an American thing, independent of the fact that you can gamble there. Like, people go there now for so many other reasons other than just gambling. And they were fortunate. But any state today that's like legalizing gambling, it's just a way to kind of help get some extra tax revenue. I mean, I don't think we'll ever see another kind of gambling community built up out of, built up from scratch ever again.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. I'd like to talk about your physical process of writing the book, and and the answer to this may just be, obviously the familial tie of your grandmother, but kind of what made you finally decide to tell this story, or at what point did you realize that there was a story this big to tell that was worth moving back to? Because you physically moved back to Hot Springs and lived there when you wrote the book.
Yeah. Well, I moved my family down there from New York for a year. I mean, I tried to write the book from New York and just traveling down every couple of months, and I realized that I'd still be writing the book if I'd kept that up, right? I mean, it just was taking too long, and it was just impossible to do good work that way. But I think for me, the beginning was this piece that I wrote for Grantland. It was called The Invaders, and it was a piece about Oaklawn Park, but it was also about my grandmother, and it was about her husband he kills a guy, and then they fix a horse race to like get the money to like get him off. And so it was sort of this like family yarn that I thought was kind of entertaining, but also I went down there and reported on this actual race at Oaklawn. So it was sort of like a flashback and forward in time kind of piece. And the reaction to the piece was pretty surprising to me. I mean, it was a very positive reaction, but it wasn't people saying like, oh, this guy's such a great writer. It was, what is this fucking place what is this town like, and who are these people in your family? So I think that's when I kind of realized that like there might be more to tell here, that growing up there I took for granted how few people outside of this radius of this sort of small blast radius outside of Hot Springs really knew
any idea
this sort of mythology. I had any idea. So leaving Arkansas and meeting getting to know people outside of that part of the country, I started and telling people about where I'm from. I mean, similar to what you were saying before about telling people about Arkansas, people couldn't believe it, right? It's just a story that people would say, how could I not know about this, right? Like, this doesn't sound like something that could be real and I wouldn't know, right? So that's why when I started realizing like, somebody's got to write this book, and it's weird that it's got to be me. Like it should have been written already, right? But like, it's so weird that this story hasn't been told yet. So that's when I felt like I wanted to tell it, and I wanted to figure out how to write it. I'm not like a historian or anything, but I definitely, am interested in things like crime and gambling and kind of outlaw culture. And I'm interested in the South, and using my own family as sort of a way to tell the story also, I think helped me figure out how I, David Hill, could write this book, right? Because before I kind of came up with that idea,
that hook,
I wasn't sure that this was a story that I should tell, right?
Yeah. I'm glad you did it, because I mean, somebody from there writing it, and the fact that your father and your grandmother are in the book makes it, just as a reader, I think, so much more interesting. Did you find that there were people you found or interviews you got to do, or just stuff by being on the ground there that you would not have been able to have got otherwise? Just by
definitely.
Just by virtue of like maybe they knew your family, or they knew you growing up, or that kind of thing.
I think what really helped more than that was getting an opportunity to sit down with people multiple times, right? Because it took sometimes multiple times for people to kind of like warm up or trust me, right? Learn to trust me that they would tell me stuff, and develop that kind of rapport, which I would not have been able to develop over the telephone or, flying in and sitting with somebody for just one session. So that helped a lot. And also kind of like, like you're suggesting, like piggybacking off of like meeting one person and then interviewing them. And then they'd sort of introduce me to other people or connect me to other folks. But honestly, I mean, the best thing about being down there for that year was just being there, right? I mean, just like literally every day walking past the actual vapors on my way to the coffee shop to write, right? Or like, like walking around in that town and be like in the footsteps of the people I was writing about. I found that totally inspiring in a way that was unexpected, right? I mean, it was, it made the process of writing, I don't know, it gave it some energy that I don't think that I anticipated.
Well, it makes it real too, because like I said, all these places are still just sitting there.
Yeah.
Like they didn't like demolish, like after they made gambling illegal, they didn't like tear the casinos down.
Right. They just put like gift shops and stuff in them. They're just selling samurai swords out of them and stuff. Yeah.
You could just buy like tie-dye t-shirts and stuff, which which the last time I was there we got. Oh, I'm also wearing my Sam's Pizza shirt for you today.
All right.
One of
Represent.
my favorite places. So other than was most of the research you did just interviews of people on the ground, or because I mean there's probably not I feel like there's not a ton of historical documents or books that I've ever seen on this topic either. Like, what was that challenging just to figure out, like, where do you start?
If I had relied just on interviews with people, I wouldn't have been able to get the story, because I think, number one, people, it's like those who know don't tell, and those who tell don't know. I think that was kind of true. Like, there were a lot of people who wouldn't talk to me at all, when I was down there, like that, for whatever reason, they're taking these secrets to their grave with them.
Still,
and they were worried that other people in town would be mad at them if their name was in my book and stuff. but a lot of the people I ended up interviewing were like the children of some of the characters in this book. And there was only so much that they knew. I mean, they could show me photographs, they could show me files and letters and personal documents and things like that were very helpful. But mostly what they could relay to me were stories that their parents had told them. I think the big kind of like what really helped me, and look, those stories that I got from people from interviews, those are the kind of more colorful anecdotes that are in the book that make it, that sort of, they're the vignettes that I think really help, give it a little bit of soul. But like, I FOIA'd a lot of FBI and Department of Justice files. I traveled to College Park, Maryland, to the National Archives to get files that I don't think anybody had ever seen before. I mean, and I had to wait years for some of these files. And I think it was when I started reading some of these files, sometimes these were like transcripts of like, wiretaps that were like a recording device that was in Dane's office in the Vapors, right? Or like phone covers. So like, it's like a terrible violation of his civil rights, but as a writer, it was like such a gold mine.
It's great
to have, like word for word dialogue. And it was like, I'm not making it up. Like, this is like what they were saying to each other when they didn't think anyone was listening. So I think finding some of those documents really helped me help me move the story along, because, a certain part of the story of Hot Springs has been written about before and has been told before, and told in a much better way than I ever could. But I needed to add something new. And I think that, I was able to do that by just doing a lot of diligent, work to dig up these documents that the government had that nobody had ever gone looking for before.
Well, I think a big part of it too is, even if some of the work had been done before or stuff had been written before, the style and the presentation you brought to it is such a big part of it. Like having there's almost like a gonzo journalism quality to the whole thing by the fact that you did go live there and your family is in the story and the whole thing. But also talk a little bit about, just the structure and the style of the book, like the multiple, POVs and the jump. And I mean, there's a lot of, there's a lot of dialogue in the book. Like the book, like when it's a real page turner, because it's like, it like I said, it reads like good fiction.
Well, you'll appreciate this. I mean, the first draft I wrote of the book was really, I outlined it just like a screenplay, right? Like I thought of it in terms of scenes. And so as I was doing research and preparing to write the book, I felt like I needed scenes, right? So I'd think like, well, I need a scene to get me from this to this, or I need a scene to, and that's how I structured it. And then when I ended up writing the first draft and I showed it to my editor was like, well, this is good, but really it's just like a bunch of scenes, He's like, he's like, what's missing is all the information, the context and the fact. So I had to go back in and add the meat and potatoes to like, but I think what was good about doing it that way, my editor said this is the way a lot of nonfiction writers do it the reverse, right? Like they forget to come up and write kind of vivid scenes. And so I had some good stuff to work with once I wrote the actual story, and then I could seed the scenes in where I needed something dramatic to sort of move the action along. In the beginning, I tried to write the book with flashbacks, right? So I wanted to start with the Vapors and being open in the 60s, which I do with the introduction, but then I wanted to just keep flashing back in time to show how we got there. But I couldn't hold that up for like, 100,000 words or whatever. As a screenplay, maybe that would have worked. Am I here? Can you see me? Or can you hear me? Oh boy. I'm not sure if I'm frozen or you are. I guess it's you, Clark. Well, I'll just keep telling the rest of you who are watching what I was telling Clark. But it was weird because I wanted to tell the story with flashbacks, and then I didn't have the opportunity to, or I couldn't figure out how to make that work over the whole course of the book. So I tell it much more linearly. But even then, I needed a way to kind of like move the reader along. And so the idea was to sort of have each chapter focus on like a different character, like one of my three main characters. And so that got me through, and I think it worked. All right, so I'm going to answer some of your questions since Clark has vanished. Did you find any involvement between the mob and Oaklawn? No, definitely not. In fact, you'll see this in the book too. Like the owners of Oaklawn, who didn't live in Hot Springs, they lived in St. Louis. They were really nervous about illegal gambling. They definitely they didn't want it for a while. In the beginning of the book in the 1930s, horse racing is illegal, and so the track is closed. And the casino owners, who are like, they're trying to get them to open the track back up by saying like, look, we're open. Like what we're doing is not legal, and we're open. You should open up too. But the owners of the track said, no, we're not going to open up until it's legal. So the casino owners actually had to work to get the state to legalize horse racing to get them to open up the track. If only they had put in the same amount of energy into get them to legalize casino gambling, then Dane Harris wouldn't have had to go through what he went through. But okay, Mama or Mima? Well, my this is a question, Mama or Mima. I called my maternal grandmother Mammy. I'm sorry to say. But Hazel was just grandma to me. Let's see. Getting to hear first-person accounts and within all the research, what was the most surprising gambling slang you found? Or is there a particular gambling term that has evolved in a fun way? Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I write a lot about gambling and read a lot about gambling, and I definitely find gambling terminology to be fun. And it evolves in such a way that like it's all very dated, right? So like certain terms belong to a certain era, and I definitely liked the way that people wrote and talked about gambling in the 20s a lot better than I think in the 60s. But there's some interesting stuff in there. You'll see there's things like kroner and lettuce for money. Hey, Clark, can you hear me all right?
Hey, yeah. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
It's all right. I just started asking myself questions from the queue.
Okay, good. This is 2020 in a nutshell. This is what it's like.
I just read like the first 3 questions.
Oh yeah, let's start taking some of the questions. I'll click the thing. Which ones did you already?
I just finished the one about gambling slang was the last one I did.
Okay. Did you go to Central or Lakeside?
I did. Oh, I didn't answer that. Central did not exist. I went to Hot Springs High School, and the middle school back then was just Hot Springs Middle School. I did not go to, I guess Central, when they say Central, they may mean the old high school building, which I think I was the last class to go through there as a middle school, but it's so weird now. When I lived there for a year, I got to send my kids to Hot Springs schools, which was a very cool experience, that have them go for a year to the schools that I went to. It was kind of something I never thought I'd get to experience, since my kids were growing up in New York City. And it's really something I lament. I mean, it's weird. I never would have imagined that I'd be raising, Yankees, for lack of a better word. My children are not going to be Southerners, which is very strange to me.
Yeah, that is interesting. Somebody said, did the Sentinel Record report on exploits from the Vapors and the other gambling establishments at the? I assume I mean at the time.
Yeah, and I talked about this in another interview that I did, and then some guy ended up writing a op-ed about it in the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. But yeah, it was a real challenge because the Sentinel Record did not really write about this stuff. At least they didn't write about. They wrote about it in such a careful way, right? Like back during most of this period of time that the book takes place, for the most part, the Sentinel Record was not interested in sort of putting the town's business out in the public, and so there were a few articles here and there, but they were always very carefully written. And what I used in the Sentinel Record more than actual journalism was political advertisements, because every time there was a political election going on, these folks would take out tons and tons of political ads in the paper on the weeks leading up to the election. And these ads were psychotic. They were crazy. And they would be long screeds against each other where they would just like totally call each other all kinds of names and put each other's business out there. So I found that the political ads sometimes were even better than reading op-eds or newspaper articles.
That's great. Deborah says, what is the most interesting story you learned that you didn't know?
That I didn't already know? Well, you know, I guess there's a lot in this book. Most of what's in this book I didn't already know.
Right.
You know, I found that that the thing that really sort of bedeviled me the entire time I was writing the book. I mean, you brought up the Cold 6000 before when you were kind of doing your intro, which I love, and like I'm a sucker for all of that stuff, right? Like I think that I almost felt like at a time like I was writing a book like that. I was so obsessed with trying to figure out like who blew up the Vapors and how to prove that like this gangster owned this. And so much of what I wanted to do was to like knock down all this mythology, solve all these mysteries, you know, crack the case. And so for a while, I just felt like I had this cork board with like red string connecting the dots. And my editor really had to pull me back from that. And he was like, no one cares, man. Nobody cares. Only you and like 5 people in Hot Springs care. Like the rest of the world just wants to know the general story, right? Like that's a good story. Like you don't have to solve all the mysteries. So, you know, I got really obsessed with digging, and also like research is a form of procrastination. You know, as a writer, I feel like it's fun to research. You could do it forever. Writing is terrifying. Writing is pain. And like, if I could just convince myself that I just need to like learn a little bit more about this topic, then that's one more day that I don't have to spend writing. And so I feel like I learned a lot of stories that I didn't need to learn just because I was avoiding writing the book. But yeah, I learned a lot about
in general too about writing, by the way.
Say what?
That makes me feel better about my own writing process that someone else does that too. Like, well, I gotta figure out the soundtrack before I can, you know.
I'll get to that when I'm done with this. This is more important than actually writing. One of the things I used to say to my wife all the time, whenever she'd look at me, whenever she'd come in like my office and see me like, you know, playing chess online or like, you know, or like with my feet up on the table reading a book, is I'd say, look, you know, writing is not typing. You know, it's all part of the process. Like this is writing. I'm writing. You don't realize it, but I'm writing. It's all happening up here, man. I don't know if that there's like 50% truth in that and maybe 50% me, you know, making excuses for myself.
I wish I was one of those psychopaths like Stephen King that like get up at 8:30 and I write from 9 to 12:30 and then I write again from 2 to 5. Like I just I don't. Do you do that?
No,
I do
not
that.
at all. No, I have to like walk around and think about it for days and days and days and then sit down and write it all in like a 6-hour, you know, crazy, like, you know, like bleary-eyed, you know, caffeine-induced mania.
I think that's pretty. I mean, because somebody was talking to me. My friend Chris was talking to me the other day about John Hughes and how there's like this, you know, all these legends of like, well, he wrote like the first draft of Ferris Bueller's Day Off in a night or a weekend or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, but I bet he was walking around thinking about it for like 6 or 8 weeks before that.
Right.
I bet he didn't just like lightning struck him and he sat down and like had it all.
Right. It's all part of the process. Like whatever it is that inspires you. Like, you know, I have to watch a lot of movies and read a lot of books before I can actually write, you know?
Yeah, I'm the same way. Somebody said, how much of the casino and vice business came from out of state or just the immediate area? Just word of mouth, sort of like the drug trade. You have to know where to look for to find it. Well, I mean, I think this kind of speaks to like how people just can't imagine how public, how local and public all this was in Hot Springs.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, the answer is that these people came from all over the world. And they didn't do it, but they didn't learn about it from word of mouth. They learned about it from advertisements that the casinos took out on radio stations all around the country. So like you could be you'd be listening to radio in Chicago and you would hear like a radio ad. They shot an episode of the Frankie Lane television show at the Vapors, right? So like it's a nationally broadcast television show that they're filming.
Yeah.
Right. This is not a speakeasy. Everybody knew. So like people traveled from all over. And this is sort of like, you know, when you were saying before, like, how did this all happen? I mean, Hot Springs was a resort town before there was gambling. It's because of the hot water, right? So people always were coming there to take these baths. I mean, yeah. So the water in the beginning, people thought the hot water had medicinal qualities. They thought that it actually could like heal you. And doctors would actually prescribe that people go take baths in them. That's why towns like Baden-Baden or Saratoga Springs, there's cities, or Desert Hot Springs. There's towns all over the world that have the name Hot Springs in them or are built around hot springs, because there was a time in history when people thought that this was healing people. So Hot Springs, Arkansas was just another one of these towns. And it became a resort because people traveled there to take these baths. And around tourists builds a kind of unsavory community. At least it did in the early part of the century, because that's where con artists went and that's where gamblers went. Everybody went to like pick their pockets and fleece them, right? I mean, it became sort of a stomping ground for unsavory characters, and that's the beginning of it all.
Speaking of unsavory characters, one of the other questions is, hey, Dave, I worked at City Hall for many years right after college, and I know I dealt with the children of some of your characters like Q. Byram Hearst. What happened to some of the families in the book? Are they still in Hot Springs?
Well, some of them are still in Hot Springs. Some of them are still in the state of Arkansas. Some of them have moved on. But yeah, I mean, I was just talking to somebody about this. Actually, last night I was watching a school board meeting. I live in Nyack, New York now, and we were watching our school board meeting on Zoom last night, and we were listening to people kind of reference all these like old families who have been a part of this community for like whatever, like 100 years, who all the streets are named after. And there's there's like, I live in a small town in New York where there's like local small town royalty, and it's weird that Hot Springs doesn't really have that, right? I mean, there's not, even though these are the families that built the town during this sort of gambling trade, just like with everything else, once gambling was gone, there was just there's no statues of any of these people built in Hot Springs. There's no busts, there's no plaques with their names on them. I mean, it's not, they're not celebrated in this community the way one might think, especially after reading this book and seeing how much these people did to build Hot Springs into kind of a world-class resort. And some of their families are, a number of the families are still around in Hot Springs, but it's not the same. And so like Dane's family, for example, they mostly have moved on and live in Little Rock and other places. Q. Byram Hearst, who the questioner mentioned, his son still lives in Hot Springs, and I interviewed him for the book, and he's a fairly prominent attorney there, also named Q. Byram Hearst Jr. All the people in this book have juniors, right? They all have namesakes.
That's a very Southern thing. I think you already answered the one about the gambling slang. Are there any talks about adapting the book into a screenplay or film?
Yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's talks. I mean, I hope it gets made into a TV or a film. You should help me out with that, Clark. You know how to get movies made.
I'm trying. We've talked about it quite a bit. Next question: Mama or Mima? I say Mama.
I answered that one before, but
okay.
Yeah.
Did you find any involvement between the mob and Oaklawn? That's a good question.
I answered that question. I answered that one too. Okay. Yeah. We did a lot while you were gone.
Yeah, apparently. Somebody said, okay, there's a couple new ones. I think we went through all of them except these. Was there any other industry to speak of in Hot Springs during the Vapors era? I mean, it's mostly the tourism, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. So like, other than gambling, I mean, what I think people might have thought was the other industry was entertainment, right? I mean, they tried to keep all this stuff going after they shut down gambling. I mean, the Vapors stays open until 1991, and even through the 1970s, they really tried to run the Vapors as like a showroom, a nightclub where they would still bring in kind of top shelf entertainment and spend a fortune trying to bring people in. The presumption being that, we can survive without gambling. People didn't come here just to gamble; they came here to see, whatever, like Pinky Lee or BB King or whatever. That's why people were coming. So if we keep bringing them here, the tourists will keep coming, which was not true. I mean, it didn't really pan out that way, but they made an effort for quite a while to keep all these nightclubs and clubs open as like showrooms for entertainment. But I think what they realized was that gambling was the sort of bedrock of the economy. Yeah.
Somebody to that end, one question here on the side or a comment: is it true the top talent played the Vapors, Sinatra, Sammy Davis, and the like?
Yeah, I mean, everybody played at the Vapors. It's wild. I mean,
Sinatra played there?
No, Sinatra never played there. The interesting thing about the Vapors really kind of it's a big deal from like 1960 to 1964, right? That's when they had gambling at the Vapors, and that's when there was a lot of really big time performers there. That's when like the Frankie Lane show did an episode from the Vapors, and you know, it's clear that like Dane Harris really tried to get you know, he wanted to kind of get a diverse type of acts. He didn't just have one type of act like lounge acts. You know, he had people came and debuted like Broadway shows there. He had Liberace play, but he'd also have comedians. He'd have dance troupes come in. I mean, it was you know, he really tried to program, or you know, I mean, book a lot of interesting and different types of acts, because I think the way that he saw it was that he was bringing like culture to the community, right? That he was bringing in stuff that you couldn't see anywhere else. And so rather than like brand the Vapors as being a certain type of club, where you just saw one type of music, whether it was jazz or big band or whatever, he wanted the Vapors to be a showroom for all kinds of entertainment that otherwise wouldn't have come to Hot Springs.
Well, I think that answers one of the other questions here. Who will Clark play in the movie Liberace?
That sounds right.
And that was also part of the whole like Dane's sort of idea for the Vapors too, to separate it and differentiate it from the other clubs, was that he had this higher end like Vegas level entertainment, right?
Yeah, and he spent a fortune on it. And I think the other club owners probably thought he was nuts, right? Because they probably imagined that. I mean, this was the same thing that went on in Vegas. They had the same kind of debate in Vegas about what is it that people want, right? And like, who are we appealing to? Like the low rollers, the grinders, or like the kind of upper crust? And Dane really, you know, he spent a fortune on bringing in all these acts because he thought the money will follow. Like, if we can get all these folks in here to see a good show, then they'll gamble. And he tested this out originally at the Tower Club, which was the first club he got a piece of in Hot Springs. So that was his first attempt to kind of show Hot Springs, this is my idea for what clubs could be like. Prior to that, it was really just about gambling. I mean, there was no pretense that like you were going to come and like, you know, you were going to come for the show. Maybe there'd be a show, but you were coming for gambling. And so Dane really tried to turn that on its head, and he spent a fortune. I mean, at a certain point when the gambling's gone, he had to turn, you know, the city started footing the bill for all these folks because it was just so much money. I mean, Dane was spending $10,000 a week on entertainment, which back then was, you know, a king's ransom. 60s. But that was the whole bet he was making.
I don't know if we have any other questions. Do you have any other? Well, somebody said, did you interview any of Oni's family or friends? Yeah.
No, I didn't interview anybody. I mean, I'm
really?
not sure that I found Oni and Agnes. So Oni marries a woman named Agnes Denby, and he and she don't have any children. So there weren't a lot of direct descendants to really reach out to. They had nieces and nephews from her family that are still in the area. But yeah, Oni and Agnes never had any children. Oni Madden, luckily, has had a lot written about him. I mean, you know, even though not a lot of people know about his time in Arkansas, there's quite a bit of work that's been done in his life. And I was able to get my hands on a lot of FBI records that dealt with Oni's time that he was in Arkansas too. So that helped a lot. I mean, he was the FBI were really hot on his ass. I mean, they thought that he was, you know, Hoover really thought that Oni Madden was like the man in Hot Springs, and it was impossible for Hoover would refuse to believe that Oni Madden wasn't in control of everything because he was such an important crime figure. And now he's down in Arkansas. And the local FBI agents kept reporting back to headquarters that Oni's retired. He's just he just hangs out. He's not doing anything. And it drove Hoover crazy. He was like, I refuse to believe that. I refuse. You go back and get me the goods on Oni. So there's quite a bit of files on Oni because they spent so much, they put so many FBI agents on him, you know, looking into him for so long. And also he plays a role in FBI files all over the country because he's having conversations with mobsters all over America, and he's sending money to mobsters all over America through this whole time. So I had the benefit of, you know, a lot of good FBI records for Oni too.
I think we're getting pretty close to the end of our time. Somebody said, will you please write one about Mina? They already did that. They already made that move.
Yeah. They just made a well. Tom Cruise was in a movie about it, right?
Yep.
They just released the like FBI files about Mina, and it's like it was supposed to be this big revelation, but it's like we already all knew that happened. We didn't need we didn't need them to declassify the documents. I mean, there's already been like 5 movies about it.
Right, right. but it sucked. It was okay.
Everybody's a critic.
Somebody said, "Oh, this is an interesting question. Is it true that there was neutrality between mafia families while visiting Hot Springs?" Like,
that's a good question, and I don't think it's true. And I think that there's plenty of evidence of this. One of the stories that I actually got cut out of the book that I really wanted to have in the book because I think it spoke to this was that there was a bit of a mob war that broke out around the country because of the federal government closing, putting pressure, the Department of Justice closing down illegal gambling all over America, city by city, which is also part of why Hot Springs rises to be so large and rivaling Las Vegas in the 1960s, because the government closed every other city in America down, but every time another one would close, Hot Springs would grow and get bigger. And when they closed Newport, Kentucky, which was another big kind of wide open gambling town, when the government and the FBI and the state of Kentucky shut down Newport, Kentucky, and then they also shut down a lot of the like Ohio area cities at the same time, the white gangsters that were sort of controlling a lot of that gambling, their livelihoods were sort of taken right out from under them. So they started moving in on African-American gambling rackets like policy wheels and number runners and stuff like that, and just started killing them and taking over their businesses. And there was this one guy, Screw Andrews, who was particularly psychotic and killed a bunch of black gambling figures and took over their operations. And that war kind of spills over into Hot Springs, and they end up finding bodies in Hot Springs that were being killed as a part of this war between these white gangsters and black gangsters. In fact, they found one of the guys right in front of Dane Harris's house on Trevista, like shot to pieces in his car. And so, there was violence in Hot Springs that was sort of connected to a lot of the beefs that went on between mobs. But there's the story that people tell in Hot Springs that I think the questioner was referring to, that there was this truce that when mobsters came to Hot Springs, they didn't fight with each other.
It was like a
also kind of part of
them.
Right.
Yeah.
This is part of the mythology of all of Hot Springs. There's a story that we grew up learning in grade school that Hot Springs was discovered by, that Native, when white people discovered Hot Springs, they found that Native Americans were using the Hot Springs as a place of peace where they would come and make peace with each other, and they'd make peace with there was no war or whatever fighting that went on. This was all like a marketing scheme that whatever his name, John Fordyce came up with to market his bathhouse. I mean, this idea of Hot Springs being this valley of peace is totally I don't know. It's just a myth, and it's not something that's based in reality. It's just sort of a nice story we like to tell. But insofar as there was gangs that didn't like each other, they didn't like each other in Hot Springs. I mean, somebody tried to kill Al Capone in Hot Springs. He gets shot up. This was in the book too. I don't know if I cut out, but he gets, somebody tries to assassinate him right there on the Little Rock Highway, and damn near gets him too. So there's definitely not a lot of truth to the idea that gangsters could come to Hot Springs and leave their beefs at the border.
That was a good one. Book Soup just said, "Hi guys, we're having trouble with tech on our end. This has been a great discussion. Have a great night, everyone." Oh, I guess that's it.
Oh, are we? Can nobody see us? Anybody else in chat see us? Oh, maybe they hear us. Oh, they can see us.
I've lost video, I think, or audio.
They say they can see us.
Can you still see me?
I see you, and the people in the chat say they can see us too.
I can't hear anybody now. Oh man.
Oh boy.
Well, I guess that seems like a good enough place as any for me to sign off. I guess because I can't hear anybody anymore.
Yeah. Well, this has been a treat. Can you hear me, Clark?
There's still a lot of stuff to work out. I can't hear anybody, but I think you can hear me. So I'll just say thanks for having me. This has been a pleasure. Everybody, please pick up the book. I think there's a button right here. You can click and buy it from Book Soup because I know it's sold out a lot of places. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you, Clark. Thanks, Book